I walked into my father's house 3 days after his funeral, carrying the kind of sadness that doesn't make noise but sits heavy on your chest. The sympathy cards were still on the dining table. I wanted to sit in his chair and breathe the same air he used to breathe. But when I opened the front door, I didn't find silence. I found my Uncle Warren. He stood in the living room with a roll of tape in his hand. The floor was covered in cardboard boxes. Each had a strip of masking tape with my father's name written in black marker. Victor's bookcase. Victor's tools. Victor's watch collection. He didn't look up when I walked in. "Didn't think you'd be here this early," he said. My father's things were half gone. The walls had patches where picture frames used to hang. The cabinet where my dad kept his folders was open and empty. "What's going on?" I said. Warren looked at me. His face was not guilty, not uncomfortable, completely calm. "Everything your father owed me, I'm taking," he said. "You're too young to understand debt." He went right back to taping boxes. I stood in the doorway and something cold moved through me that had nothing to do with the weather. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just watched him work like I had walked into someone else's performance. He moved around my father's living room like he owned it, which apparently was exactly what he believed. As he dragged a box toward the front door, he laughed. Not a nervous laugh, a real, genuine laugh, like something about the situation genuinely amused him. "He never told you about this," he said, shaking his head. Classic Victor, always protecting his little girl from the truth. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph. He held it up between two fingers like a playing card. It was a picture of my father handing Warren a thick envelope. The photo looked old, creased at the corners. My dad looked younger in it, maybe mid-40s. "That's your father paying me," Warren said. "Proof of the debt. Since he left nothing to cover the rest, everything here counts." He tucked the photo back into his jacket pocket and picked up another box. "You can keep the photo frames on the wall," he added. "I'm not heartless." He said it pleasantly. Something hardened in me right then. A quiet, solid thing settling into place. I didn't respond. I just watched. People always imagine that when something terrible happens, you fall apart immediately. You scream. You throw things. You collapse in a doorway while neighbors come running. I didn't do any of that. My name is Maya. I was 26 years old on the day I walked into my father's stripped living room. I had buried him 4 days earlier, and I was still so deep inside my grief that I could barely feel anything new on top of it. But underneath the shock, I noticed something happening. Something that felt less like panic and more like a very sharp, very cold kind of clarity. I looked at Warren. I looked at the boxes. I looked at the empty patches on the walls. And then I took one slow, careful breath. Warren glanced at me sideways, waiting for the reaction. The tears, the begging, the outburst he could brush aside easily. Instead, I said very quietly, "I'm going to need you to leave now." He blinked. "Excuse me." "I'll be in touch," I said. Then I stepped aside and held the door open for him. I watched him carry the boxes to his van. I watched him drive away. Then I sat down in my father's chair, put my hands in my lap, and started thinking. My dad, Victor, raised me alone from the time I was 9 years old. My mother left when I was young. It was just the two of us in that house for 17 years. He worked as a building contractor, the same trade as his brother Warren, but my dad built his business on reliability and fair pricing. He wasn't rich. He was steady. He paid for 2 years of my college before I took over with scholarships and part-time work. He argued with me every semester about it. On Sunday mornings, we cooked breakfast together. Scrambled eggs, toast, strong coffee. He would tell me stories about jobs he had worked in his 20s, buildings he helped construct that were still standing across the city. On weekends in spring, we drove to the park near the old water tower where he had taken me as a little girl. We would sit on the same bench and talk about everything and nothing. He taught me that a calm person in a chaotic room has all the power. He used to say, "Maya, loud people make the most noise. Quiet people make the most moves." Sitting in his chair that afternoon after Warren's van disappeared down the street, I understood for the very first time exactly what he meant. The week after the funeral, people came and went from my father's neighborhood the way they do after a loss. Neighbors brought food. Church friends stopped by. Warren's friends came too. A man named Clyde who had worked on job sites with both brothers for years, and a woman named Petra who always seemed to know everyone's business before anyone mentioned it. They were at the house one afternoon when I happened to be there clearing the kitchen. I didn't say much. I listened. Clyde was talking to Petra near the hallway when I caught part of their conversation. "Warren's always been like this," Clyde said quietly, "even when they were young. Victor warned me about him years ago. Said to never lend the man anything you weren't prepared to lose." Petra nodded. "That photo he's going around showing people? Victor told me he paid that money back years ago. Warren just kept the photo." I didn't walk out and announce what I had heard. I went back to the kitchen, finished wrapping the glasses in newspaper, and filed every word away. That was the moment I understood this wasn't just grief or ordinary family tension. This was a pattern, long practiced and deliberate, and I was going to need far more than feelings to stop it. I gave myself 1 full week of grief. I sat with my father's absence. I let myself cry in the mornings and go quiet in the evenings. I called his voicemail 3 times just to hear his voice again. I didn't rush any of it. Then, on the 8th day, I made a list. Every item Warren had taken or claimed went on that list. Every statement he had made in front of me or in front of witnesses. Every date. Every detail I could recall. I bought a small voice recorder and kept it in my jacket pocket. I went through my dad's documents, the ones Warren hadn't reached, which I had quietly moved to my apartment the morning after I first found him in the house with the boxes. I found the original property deed, the car title, a bank account summary my father had mailed to me 6 months earlier. I started making careful, quiet calls. I contacted my dad's bank. I called the county records office. I reached out to a paralegal I knew through work, who pointed me toward the right kind of attorney. I was not panicking. I was not reacting. With every phone call and every document, I was building something. Warren had no idea. About 2 weeks after the funeral, Warren hosted a small dinner at his house. I wasn't invited, but Clyde was. And Clyde talked to Petra, who talked to a woman named Audrey from my father's church, who had known our family for years and thought I deserved to know what was being said. Audrey called me the next morning. Warren had told his guests that the matter of my father's estate was handled. He used that exact word, handled. He said he had recovered everything Victor owed him and that there was nothing left to dispute. He said she won't do anything. She's grieving and she has nothing. What is she going to do? He laughed when he said it. Audrey told me she had felt sick sitting at that table. I thanked her and asked whether she would be willing to write down what she remembered and sign it. She said yes without any hesitation. What Warren didn't understand was that every time he bragged in a room full of other people, he was creating witnesses. Every laugh, every casual dismissal, every confident declaration that I was powerless, all of it was becoming evidence. He was building my case without knowing he was the one holding the shovel. 3 weeks later, Warren made his next move. My father had owned a 2019 pickup truck, dark blue, well-maintained, still worth a solid amount. Warren had taken the spare keys from the house. He posted the truck for sale online and arranged for a buyer to come see it on a Saturday morning. I found out through Clyde, who was asked to be present when the buyer arrived. He texted me the morning it happened. I had already filed the vehicle title in my name the previous week. I did it legally and quietly because my name appeared as beneficiary on the estate documentation my father had completed 2 years before his death. The title transfer had gone through without a single problem. When the buyer arrived and ran the vehicle identification number, the registered owner on record was me, not Warren. Warren stood in the driveway with nothing that made sense to say. The buyer left. Warren called me within 20 minutes. His voice had changed from every call before. Higher, less controlled. "What did you do?" he said. I said, "I protected what belongs to me." Then I ended the call. That was the first time I heard real uncertainty in his voice. It would not be the last. The following week, I moved quietly through the estate's remaining accounts. My father had 3 accounts still open: a utility account tied to the house, a work subscription, and a savings account requiring estate paperwork to access. Warren had already attempted to make changes to 2 of them. The bank told me when I called to follow up on my own inquiry. They couldn't share details, but they confirmed that changes had been attempted and rejected because the proper estate documentation had not been submitted. I filed the proper documentation that same day. I closed the utility account cleanly and transferred final billing to the estate record. I canceled the subscription service. The savings account was placed in probate freeze, which meant nobody, not Warren, not anyone, could access it until the estate was legally settled. Warren called me that evening. He was not calm. "You're interfering," he said. "Those accounts were part of what he owed me." "Accounts require legal process," I said. "Talk to a lawyer." "You think you know what you're doing." "I do," I said. There was a pause. Then he hung up. I wrote the time and the content of the call in my notebook and set it beside the voice recorder on my nightstand. Warren changed strategies. The week after the failed account changes, he stopped calling to argue. He started calling to talk. He called on a Tuesday evening and opened the conversation by asking how I was doing, whether I was sleeping, whether I had people around me. I answered politely and gave him nothing useful. Then he moved to the debt again, but this time he softened it. He talked about my father's early years. He said my dad had borrowed money from him 3 separate times, once in his 30s to launch the business and twice more when work slowed down. "Your father was a proud man," Warren said. "He didn't want you knowing he struggled." I respected that. But debt is still debt, Maya. I'm not the villain here. He paused. "You're grieving," he added. "That's understandable. But don't let grief push you towards something that damages the only family you have left." I let him finish. Then I said, "Thank you for calling." And I ended the call. I wasn't moved. I understood exactly what he was doing. He had tried force. When that hadn't worked, he shifted to guilt. The guilt wasn't going to work either. I let the truth spread on its own. I didn't post anything publicly. I didn't send long messages. When people who had known my father asked how things were going, I answered honestly. I told them about the boxes in the living room. I described the photograph Warren had waved around as proof. I shared what Clyde and Petra had said about the debt being repaid years ago. I explained the truck situation plainly and without drama. I didn't ask anyone to take sides. I didn't cry or raise my voice. I told the same truth in the same way every time to anyone who asked. Word moved the way it always does in families and neighborhoods, quietly but thoroughly. Warren was still telling his version at dinners and backyard conversations, but more and more people were now hearing a second version that included specific dates, documented records, and named witnesses. At a church event 2 weeks later, I watched Warren approach a group of people he usually dominated in conversation. They went quiet when he arrived, politely quiet, the kind of quiet that carries meaning. He noticed. I saw his eyes move across the group, then land briefly on me across the room. I gave him a small nod and looked away. About a month after the funeral, I received a phone call from a man named Arthur. He introduced himself as my father's accountant. They had worked together for 11 years. Arthur explained he had been traveling at the time of my father's passing and had only recently heard the full story. He asked if we could meet. We sat in a diner 2 days later, and Arthur placed a manila folder on the table between us. Inside were copies of financial records going back 12 years. He walked me through them carefully. My father had indeed borrowed money from Warren, twice, not 3 times as Warren had claimed. The first loan, from 22 years ago, had been fully repaid within 3 years. Arthur had the bank records and the signed receipts. The second loan, from 12 years ago, had been settled through a formal arrangement in which Warren received payment in labor. My father had personally managed a complete renovation of Warren's house, a job valued at significantly more than the remaining debt. "Your uncle has no legal claim," Arthur said. He laid the folder flat on the table. "None. He cannot demonstrate outstanding debt because there is none." He slid the folder across to me. "Your father kept everything," Arthur said. 2 days after my meeting with Arthur, Warren called again. The warmth from the previous call was completely gone. He told me he had spoken with his own lawyer. He said what I had done with the vehicle title was potentially fraudulent. He said the estate was being mismanaged, and he had standing to challenge it in court. He warned me that if I didn't cooperate, he would go to the family publicly and make sure everyone understood I was the one causing the problem. "You're making this harder than it has to be," he said. I let him talk until he finished. Then I said, "Warren, I want you to know that I have been recording our conversations since the first day you were in my father's living room with those boxes. Not all of them, but most." Silence. "Recording is legal in this state," I continued. "One-party consent." I checked before I started. More silence. "I also have a very good lawyer, and she has already reviewed everything. I suggest you speak with yours before you call me again." He started to say something. Then he stopped. I said goodbye and ended the call. He did not call back that evening. My lawyer, Nina, had been recommended to me by the paralegal I had contacted in my very first week of preparing. Nina was precise and thorough in a way that reminded me of how my father used to describe the people he trusted most. She reviewed Arthur's financial records, the vehicle title transfer, my recorded conversations, Audrey's written statement, and every note I had been keeping since the first afternoon. She spent 4 days on it all. Then she sent a formal letter to Warren's lawyer. It was detailed and exact. It listed every asset Warren had removed from my father's property. It referenced the financial records, proving both debts had been fully settled. It cited the vehicle title as validly transferred under estate law. It requested the immediate return of all removed items and formally contested any claim to outstanding debt. It also stated that any further attempt to access estate assets without court authorization would be treated as civil theft. Warren's lawyer responded within 48 hours, requesting 2 weeks to review. Nina told me that was a sign. "Lawyers with strong cases don't ask for more time," she said. "They respond." 2 weeks passed. Warren's lawyer requested another extension. Nina said no. She filed the motion to freeze all contested assets the next morning. The freeze changed things quickly. Warren had been relying on 2 longtime friends for support, men who had helped him load the boxes, men he had told his version of the story to. When the legal freeze was filed and the formal notice arrived, his friends began pulling back. Clyde told me later that Warren had called him asking for help drafting a counter-response. Clyde had declined. He said he didn't want to be involved in something heading toward courtroom. Another man, someone who had helped transport items from my father's house that first day, quietly contacted Nina's office and offered to confirm what he had witnessed. Warren's small circle of supporters was shrinking. He was also discovering that the confidence he had projected, the certainty that I had nothing and would do nothing, had made him careless. He had bragged too freely. He had moved too fast. He had assumed grief would paralyze me long enough for him to take everything cleanly. He had been wrong about all of it. At a family gathering that month, people who used to follow Warren's lead in conversations now changed the subject when he brought up my father's estate. Nobody argued with him. They just stopped agreeing. That silence said more than anything I could have. 6 weeks after the funeral, people started coming back to me. Not dramatically, not with speeches or announcements. It happened the way real things happen, quietly and one person at a time. My father's neighbor, Hilda, who had known our family for 20 years, knocked on my apartment door one Saturday morning. She brought groceries and an apology. She said she had believed Warren because he was older and so certain. She was sorry for doubting me without asking questions. I thanked her and made tea. 2 cousins on my father's side called within the same week. They had heard the details and wanted to know if there was anything they could do. People from my father's church reached out, men and women who had known Victor for decades. Some offered to write formal statements. Some simply wanted me to know they understood what had happened. Warren had framed everything from the beginning as a private debt dispute between family members, something reasonable and boring. But the more people heard the actual details, the boxes, the photo, the truck sale, the false claims, the more clearly they could see what it actually was. It was not a debt dispute. It was a theft carried out during a daughter's grief. People don't forget something like that. Warren made his worst mistake in week 7. He posted something on his social media page. He had been frustrated for days, and it showed. Audrey saw it immediately and sent me a screenshot within minutes. The post didn't name me directly, but every person who knew us would recognize the situation immediately. He wrote about an entitled young woman who was turning a simple family matter into a legal circus because she couldn't accept the reality of her father's obligations. He said some people hide behind lawyers because they can't handle an honest conversation. He had written it in a moment of frustration. Nina was very interested when I sent her the screenshot. She added it to the case file as evidence of Warren's public statements about an active legal dispute. It demonstrated he had been discussing the matter outside of legal channels. It directly contradicted his lawyer's earlier claim that Warren wished to resolve things privately. It also supported the pattern of intimidation and reputation attack that Nina had already been carefully building into our case. Warren thought he was venting. He was actually handing us documentation. The hearing was scheduled for the following month. The hearing was just a few weeks away. I slept well that night. The hearing was on a Thursday morning in early spring. I wore a gray blazer that had belonged to my father. He had bought it years ago for a client meeting and rarely worn it. It was slightly too big on me. I didn't care. Warren arrived with his lawyer and 2 character witnesses. He had spent weeks preparing. Nina presented our case methodically. She laid out Arthur's financial records. She played 2 recordings. She submitted Audrey's written statement and statements from 2 additional witnesses. She presented the social media post. Warren's lawyer argued that the loans had never been formally repaid. Nina produced the receipts and bank records. He argued the vehicle title transfer had been premature. Nina cited the estate documentation my father had signed 2 years before his death. The judge asked Warren 3 direct questions. Warren answered all 3. His answers did not match the documentation on the table. The judge ruled in my favor. Warren was ordered to return all removed property immediately and to pay fines for the unlawful removal of estate assets. He was also ordered to cover a portion of my legal costs. He sat very still when the ruling was read aloud. Outside the courthouse, Nina shook my hand. I thought about my father's chair and breathed slowly. 2 months after the ruling, the returned items were back inside the house. I took a weekend to go through everything carefully. My father's watch collection, his tools, his folders of records going back 20 years, his bookcase with the books still in exactly the order he had always kept them, spines aligned, organized by subject. I sat with all of it for a long time. Then I started making plans. My father had run a small contracting business for over 20 years. He had a reputation in the community, solid relationships with suppliers, and a name that people genuinely trusted. He had never expanded it beyond himself and 2 part-time crew members, not because he lacked the skill, but because he never had the time or the bandwidth to grow it and run it at the same time. I had a business degree I had never fully used. I had my father's name and his reputation, and I had something I hadn't expected, a community of people who had watched me face an impossible situation with patience, strategy, and without cruelty. I registered the business in both our names, Victor and Maya's Contracting. I contacted 3 of my father's former clients and told them I was continuing his work. All 3 called back within a week. Warren's situation changed in the months after the ruling in ways I had not arranged and did not need to. His 2 closest friends had already distanced themselves during the legal process. After the ruling, 2 more professional contacts quietly stopped returning his calls. He had spent years maintaining his reputation through the story he told, the experienced older brother, the man who understood how things really worked. That story required people to believe him. The court record was now publicly available. A contractor he had been in discussions with for a joint project pulled out of the arrangement. Warren told people it was for unrelated reasons, but Clyde mentioned that the contractor had done a background search and found the hearing record. At a family event that summer, Warren came and sat in the corner. He spoke mostly with people who hadn't been following things closely. Nobody confronted him. Nobody was deliberately unkind. But the room had rearranged itself around him without anyone deciding to do it. The people who used to naturally orbit his conversations had quietly found other places to be. I saw him from across the room at one point. He looked older than I remembered. Not in any satisfying way, just in the way people look when they have spent energy badly. The business grew faster than I had expected. By the 6th month, I had 4 steady clients and a crew of 3. By the end of the first year, I had more work coming in than I could manage alone and was actively hiring 2 additional people. Most of the growth came through word of mouth. My father's name opened the first doors. The work I delivered and the way I ran things kept those doors open. In the fall of that first year, I was contacted by a woman named Brenda who operated a mid-sized construction firm across the city. She had heard about the business through 2 mutual contacts and wanted to meet. We met on a Wednesday morning over coffee. Brenda had been in contracting for 30 years. She was direct, sharp, and asked very good questions. She said she had been considering expanding her company and was looking for a reliable partner, someone who understood the residential side of things the way she understood commercial work. She proposed a formal partnership arrangement. I asked for 2 weeks to review everything with a business attorney before responding. She smiled and said, "Good. Hasty decisions are how people end up in situations they can't get out of." 2 weeks later, I said yes. About a year after the hearing, I drove to the park near the old water tower. My father and I had come here every spring for as long as I remembered. The bench we always used was still there, facing the pond where ducks gathered in the afternoon. I sat alone and stayed a long time. The business was running well. The partnership with Brenda was working. I had people on the crew I trusted completely. I was sleeping properly for the first time since my father's death. On the drive out of the park, I passed the main road that ran through the commercial strip near the neighborhood where Warren lived. There was a new billboard on that street. It was ours, Victor and Maya's Contracting. A photograph of a recently completed home renovation, clean and sharp against a bright background. A phone number, a simple tagline my father had used his entire career, built to last. I hadn't chosen the billboard location myself. The advertising agency had simply selected the highest traffic spot available in that area. I found out later through Clyde that Warren drove that road to work every single morning. Clyde said Warren had been asked once what he thought of the billboard. Warren said nothing and changed the subject. That was enough. By the 2nd year, things I had not planned started happening on their own. A local community magazine ran a feature about a daughter reviving her father's contracting legacy. The writer had found me through one of my father's old clients. I agreed to the interview, but asked to keep the family conflict minimal. The writer respected that entirely. The article focused on the work, the community ties, and my father's name. The response was larger than I expected. Former clients of my father called. New clients called. A community center reached out asking if I would speak at an event for young people interested in trades and entrepreneurship. I said yes. I stood in front of about 40 young people, most in their late teens and early 20s. I talked about my father, about patience, about the difference between reacting and responding, about staying calm when everything around you is designed to make you panic. I didn't mention Warren by name. I didn't need to. Afterward, 3 people came up and told me they were dealing with something similar in their own families and had never felt like they had permission to respond the way I described. I told them they had always had permission. I heard about Warren's tax situation through Arthur, who had stayed in touch as a resource for the business. The financial records Arthur had compiled had apparently raised questions during a routine audit that identified inconsistencies in Warren's reported income across several years. The same years Warren claimed my father still owed him money. The audit process was slow. Warren had to hire a tax attorney. His long-term partner of 9 years, a woman named Gloria, moved out of their shared home in the spring. Clyde mentioned it briefly. I didn't ask for details. Warren had built his identity around being the person who understood things others didn't. The experienced older brother, the man with leverage, the one who knew how real debt worked. One by one, the structures supporting that identity were giving way under their own weight. Not because I had pushed them, because they had never been built on anything solid to begin with. I thought about my father often during those months, about how he had always known exactly who Warren was. He had simply chosen his whole life to keep the peace. I had made a different choice, and it had cost me nothing I wasn't willing to spend. I went back to my father's house on the 2nd anniversary of his death. The house was mine now, properly and legally. I had decided to keep it and was slowly renovating it the way my father would have, carefully without rushing, making sure each part was solid first. I sat in his chair, the same chair I had sat in on that first terrible afternoon when Warren's van was disappearing down the street and the walls were bare and the air smelled like absence. The chair still felt like him. I thought about everything those 2 years had held. The boxes, the photograph, the truck, Arthur's folder, the recordings, the hearing, the ruling, the billboard, the partnership, the business carrying his name. My father used to say preparation beats emotion every time. He said the loudest person in a room has already lost the advantage. He was right. I had not won because I was lucky. I won by staying calm, documenting everything, trusting the right people, and letting the truth do the heavy work. The lesson my father lived quietly his whole life was the one his death forced me to learn. Respect yourself first, build without spite, and never let someone else's cruelty become your panic. That was what he left me. It was enough.